it's much more inelastic than this demand curve. Whereas here, it was the demand curve that was really inelastic. And so the demanders took on that burden.
How would that work with gas?
With gas,
Because if the price goes up just 5 cents each, it's not like we can't buy gas.
Well, we buy less,
so we got to make sure we
We drive less.
we got to define this right. So are we talking about the whole gas market, all gas? Or are we talking about there's a Shell station and then a Chevron station right next door to each other?
The whole picture.
The whole picture. I mean, what do you think the elasticity of demand looks like for gasoline? All gasoline.
I think it's straight up and down.
Pretty much straight up and down, right? And so if the government puts on a tax, they're going to shift the supply curve back to the left, right? By this distance, whatever the tax is. And so this is going to be our new price. That's just the tax. And our demand, sorry, the quantity demanded is not going to really change. Equilibrium quantity, maybe it changed just a little bit, but not very much at all, right? And so who's going to pay the tax? The consumer is going to pay almost all of the tax. This is why we tax gasoline and cigarettes. Because the government doesn't really mind taxing a product like that when the people are going to have to pay for it. If they were to try and tax something that the consumer would have to pay for, they would basically be putting the consumer out of business. They would, if they were to tax brownies, right? Brownie manufacturers would end up going out of business because they would have to take a big chunk of that tax. They would take that in as a loss. And so people would switch over and they start buying cookies and pie, and the brownie manufacturers. First of all, the brownie manufacturers would get together and they would riot and complain that this isn't fair, that you're taxing brownies, when really it's cookies and pie that are making everybody fat and lazy. And so they would get together and push for that, and the government wouldn't tax something like that. They're going to tax something that has a very inelastic demand curve. That puts the burden on the consumer, puts the burden on a lot of consumers, and so each consumer can pay a little bit of that tax, and you're not putting people out of business. That's why whenever they increase the taxes on gasoline, the gasoline people, they don't really care. If they're selling gasoline, we don't care. We know what the demand curve for gasoline looks like. People are going to buy gasoline, so tax it. That's not going to hurt us. What are they going to do? What do they do with that extra cost?
They charge us.
They pass it on to the consumer, right? You hear that thrown out a lot of times, that, well, if we get charged more, we're just going to pass that along to the consumer. You hear people talk like that, but people don't really pass things on to the consumer. What passes things on to the consumer, what passes that extra cost on to the consumer, is the relative elasticities. So the gas station people, the gas sellers are able to pass it on to the consumer, not because they're special and they're hotshot business people, but it's because of the elasticities. And the brownie manufacturers would not be able to pass it on to the consumer because of the elasticities of brownies. Make sense? Questions? More brownies?